What if I told you that the world before the flood was both a paradise and a nightmare? By the end of this video, you'll see how life flourished and crumbled before God's judgment, and why this ancient time holds a powerful warning for the world we live in today. Miss this, and you could overlook key insights that can change how you view our present and future. The world before the flood. In the days before the Great Flood, the world was a paradox of beauty and tragedy. The earth, in its infancy, was bursting with life and abundance. Verdant forests stretched for miles, rivers glistened like veins of silver, and mountains stood tall, their peaks disappearing into the heavens. Every corner of the world sang with the Creator's glory, a testament to the divine power that had called it into being. Animals roamed freely, and the harmony between nature and man was palpable. Yet beneath this outward beauty lay a festering darkness. Humanity, the pinnacle of God's creation, was on a path of self-destruction. With each generation, the hearts of men grew cold, their thoughts consumed with evil. They had turned away from God, forsaking His ways and seeking after their own desires. The rebellion that began with Adam and Eve's disobedience had spread like a plague, corrupting the very fabric of society. God, in His infinite wisdom and sorrow, looked down upon the world He had made. His heart ached as He saw the violence, greed, and moral decay that now defined the lives of His children. They had forgotten Him, the very source of their existence, and in their pride, they believed they could live without His guidance. The world before the flood was a cautionary tale, a reflection of what happens when humanity turns away from righteousness and embraces darkness. Yet even in the midst of such overwhelming wickedness, God's mercy was ever present. He waited, offering countless opportunities for repentance, sending messengers to call His people back to Him. But their ears were deaf to the truth, their hearts hardened by sin. The world before the flood was not merely a moment in history. It was a reflection of the path that humanity can take again if they do not heed God's warnings. As you read the story of the antediluvian world, remember that it is not just about the past. It is a mirror showing us the potential consequences of living apart from God. The flood that came was not an act of vengeance, but of justice and mercy, a reset for a world that had lost its way. In every moment of judgment, there was still the hope of redemption for those who sought after the Creator. Chapter 2. Creation and Blessing of the Early Earth. In the beginning, when the earth was still fresh with the breath of God, the world was a masterpiece of divine artistry. The stars were set in place like diamonds scattered across a velvet sky, and the sun rose each day, casting a golden glow upon the land. The moon, pale and serene, watched over the earth by night. The seas roared with life, and the mountains stood tall, their peaks touching the heavens. Every living thing, plants, trees, animals, moved in harmony with the rhythm of creation, each playing its part in the symphony of life that God had orchestrated. The early earth was not only beautiful, it was a place of perfect peace and abundance. There was no death, no pain, no sorrow. Every creature, from the smallest insect to the great beasts of the field, lived in harmony. The lion walked beside the lamb, and the birds of the air sang songs of joy. The garden where Adam and Eve lived was the crown jewel of this creation. Lush with trees bearing fruit in every season, the ground yielded its bounty without toil or struggle. The rivers that flowed through the garden sparkled like crystal, nourishing everything they touched. Adam and Eve, made in the image of God, were the pinnacle of this creation. Their days were filled with joy as they walked in the cool of the garden, hand in hand with their Creator. They knew no shame, no fear, for they were pure and blameless. The earth was their inheritance, a gift from God, and they were charged with its care. They ruled over the animals with wisdom and kindness, their hearts fully aligned with God's will. For this paradise, as perfect as it was, rested on a single command: not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God's blessing upon the earth and mankind was conditional on their obedience. For true love and worship must come from choice, not coercion. And so, the early earth flourished under the care of its first inhabitants, a reflection of God's own heart, full of life and abundance. Yet, as we know, this perfect world was not to last. Though the earth was blessed and mankind had dominion over it, the seeds of rebellion were already being planted. The choice before Adam and Eve, to obey or to disobey, was a test of their devotion to their Creator. This chapter of creation, as beautiful as it was only the beginning of a much larger story, one where mankind's decisions would shape the future of the world and the course of history itself. Chapter 3. The Fall of Man. Sin enters the world. It was a single moment, a fleeting decision, but it would change the course of history forever. Adam and Eve stood before the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, their hearts pounding with curiosity. The serpent's voice was smooth, dripping with deceit as he whispered his lies. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? His words planted the seed of doubt in Eve's mind, twisting the truth and tempting her to question the very goodness of God. The fruit was beautiful, shimmering in the sunlight, and as Eve reached out her hand, time seemed to slow. This was the moment, an act of rebellion that would unleash sin into the world. Adam, standing beside her, made no move to stop her, and when she offered the fruit to him, he took it without hesitation. In that instant, the world as they knew it was shattered. The taste of the fruit was sweet, but its consequences were bitter. Immediately their eyes were opened, and they saw their nakedness. Shame flooded their hearts, a feeling they had never known before. They covered themselves with fig leaves, desperate to hide their vulnerability. But the real consequence was the broken relationship with their Creator. When God walked through the garden, calling for them, Adam and Eve hid, their once open hearts now clouded with fear and guilt. The punishment was swift and just. The ground, once a source of life and abundance, was now cursed. Thorns and thistles would spring up, and mankind's labor would become one of toil and struggle. Eve would experience pain in childbirth, and her relationship with Adam would be marked by tension and strife. Most devastating of all, they were cast out of the garden, banished from the presence of God. The gates of paradise were closed, guarded by a flaming sword. But even in this moment of judgment, there was a glimmer of hope. God's words to the serpent held a promise. One day, the offspring of the woman would crush the serpent's head. This was the first hint of redemption, the first sign that God's love and mercy would triumph over sin. Yet for now, the world was forever changed. Sin had entered the human heart, and its consequences would ripple through every generation to come. The fall of man was not just a moment of disobedience. It was the start of a cosmic battle between good and evil, light and darkness. The peace and harmony of the early earth were shattered, replaced by a world where mankind would struggle to survive, both physically and spiritually. This was the beginning of mankind's long journey back to God, a journey marked by suffering, sacrifice, and ultimately, salvation. Chapter 4. The expansion of humanity and its downfall. As the generations passed, mankind multiplied upon the earth. Adam and Eve's descendants spread across the land, building cities, cultivating the soil, and mastering the art of survival. The early generations lived long lives, hundreds of years, giving them time to acquire great knowledge and wisdom. They became skilled in architecture, agriculture, and craftsmanship, their hands shaping the world around them. The earth itself, though cursed, still yielded its bounty to those who worked it with care. Yet with each passing generation, the hearts of men grew further from God. The memory of the garden, of walking in the cool of the day with the Creator, faded from their minds. Instead of seeking after righteousness, mankind sought after power, wealth, and fame. They built monuments to their own greatness, raising cities that reached toward the heavens. Their pride grew, and with it, their rebellion. Mankind's downfall was not immediate. It was a slow descent, a gradual turning away from the ways of God. At first, the sins were small: envy, greed, selfishness. But soon they spiraled into something much darker. Men began to take many wives, not out of love, but out of a desire to dominate and control. The strong oppressed the weak, and violence spread like a disease across the land. The cities, once places of prosperity and community, became centers of corruption and moral decay. God watched in sorrow as his creation spiraled further into chaos. The knowledge he had given them, the wisdom to rule over the earth with care and compassion, was now being twisted for selfish gain. Humanity had become arrogant, believing they could rule the world without acknowledging the Creator. They worshipped idols, the works of their own hands, thinking that they could control their own destinies. But in doing so, they had forgotten the one who had breathed life into them. The expansion of humanity, with all its potential for good, had instead become a story of downfall. The earth groaned under the weight of sin, its beauty marred by the violence and injustice of mankind. God's heart was heavy with grief as he watched the people he had created for fellowship and love turn their backs on him. The world was on the brink of destruction, and only a few remained who still sought after the Creator. But even in this dark time, there was still a glimmer of hope. A remnant who would carry the light of God's truth forward into the next chapter of human history. Chapter 5. The Giants and the Nephilim. In the days before the flood, there walked upon the earth a race of giants, known as the Nephilim. These beings were not ordinary men, but the offspring of an unholy union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. They were mighty, both in stature and in reputation. Known as men of great renown, their presence on the earth added a new layer of corruption to an already wicked world. The Nephilim were powerful, and with their strength came a sense of invincibility. They towered over ordinary men, their size and might inspiring both fear and awe. They used their power to dominate others, enforcing their will upon the weak and spreading violence wherever they went. The people of the time looked up to them, not as heroes, but as gods. They sought to emulate the Nephilim, striving for power, control, and the fulfillment of their basest desires. But the Nephilim were not a blessing. They were a curse. Their existence was a distortion of the natural order, a rebellion against the divine boundaries that God had set in place. The sons of God were never meant to take human wives, and the children born from these unions carried with them a legacy of violence and sin. They taught men to wage war, to seek after power at any cost, and to indulge in their darkest desires. As the Nephilim spread across the earth, so too did the influence of evil. The people, already prone to sin, were now led even further astray by the giants in their midst. The violence that filled the earth during this time was unlike anything known before or since. Mankind had become consumed by wickedness, their thoughts and actions driven by a desire for self-gratification at the expense of others. God's heart was grieved by what he saw. The presence of the Nephilim was a symbol of mankind's complete rebellion against his divine order. Rather than living in humility and seeking after his ways, humanity had chosen to follow the path of the Nephilim, a path that led only to destruction. The giants, once seen as mighty and powerful, were now revealed as agents of chaos, leading the world further into darkness. The story of the Nephilim is a reminder of the dangers of pride, power, and rebellion against God's order. Even in a world filled with beauty and abundance, mankind's lust for control and dominance can lead to unimaginable destruction. The Nephilim may have been giants in the eyes of men, but in the eyes of God, They were a symbol of the deep corruption that had taken hold of the earth. Chapter 6. God's Grief Over Creation. As the world grew darker, God watched with a heavy heart. The earth, once a place of beauty and abundance, was now filled with violence, corruption, and sin. Every thought of man's heart was only evil continually. The people he had created in his image, the ones he had breathed life into, had turned away from him, rejecting his love and choosing the path of destruction. God's grief over creation was profound. He had given mankind everything: life, abundance, wisdom, and his love. And yet they had forsaken it all. The world was no longer a reflection of his glory. It had become a shadow of what it was meant to be. The animals, once peaceful and harmonious, were now at odds with one another. The earth itself groaned under the weight of sin, its beauty marred by the actions of humanity. Yet even in his grief, God's love for his creation remained. He could not stand to see the world continue in its current state, but he also did not want to destroy the people he had created. His heart was torn between justice and mercy, between the need to cleanse the earth of its corruption and the desire to save those who sought after him. God sent messengers to the people, calling them to repent, to turn back to him and forsake their wicked ways. But the people laughed at righteousness, mocking those who tried to live according to God's laws. They scorned the warnings of judgment, believing that life would continue as it always had. Their hearts were hardened, and they refused to listen. God's grief over creation reached its peak as he realized that there was no other choice. The world could no longer bear the weight of such sin. Mankind had chosen to walk in darkness, and the time for judgment had come. But even in this moment of impending destruction, God's mercy was still present. He would not destroy everything. There would be a remnant, a small group of faithful people who would survive the coming judgment and carry on the legacy of his love. The story of God's grief over creation is a powerful reminder of his deep love for humanity. Even when we turn away from him, his heart aches for us. He is not quick to anger or judgment, but when justice is required, he acts with both righteousness and mercy. The flood was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of love, a way to cleanse the earth and give humanity a fresh start. Chapter 7. Noah, the faithful man, amidst a corrupt world. In the midst of a world consumed by sin, there was one man who stood out as righteous and blameless: Noah. While the hearts of men were filled with evil, Noah walked faithfully with God. His life was a testament to what it meant to seek after righteousness, even when surrounded by corruption. Noah was not perfect, but his heart was open to God, and he trusted in his word, even when it seemed impossible. God looked down upon the earth and saw that it was filled with violence and corruption. Yet, in the midst of this darkness, he saw Noah, a man who had not given in to the ways of the world. Noah was different. He was a man of faith, a man who still sought after God's will. And because of his faithfulness, God chose Noah to be the one through whom he would preserve life on the earth. God spoke to Noah, revealing his plan to send a great flood that would cleanse the earth of its corruption. He gave Noah detailed instructions on how to build an ark, a massive vessel that would carry him, his family, and the animals through the waters of judgment. The task was immense, but Noah did not hesitate. He obeyed God's command without question, trusting that his word was true. For many years, Noah labored in obedience, building the ark exactly as God had instructed. His neighbors mocked him, laughing at the idea of a flood that would cover the earth. They had never seen such a thing and believed that life would continue as it always had. But Noah remained steadfast in his faith, even as the world around him rejected the warnings of judgment. Noah's faith was not just a passive belief. It was an active, living trust in God. He knew that God's word was true, even when it made no sense to those around him. He worked diligently, preparing for the flood that was to come, even as his neighbors continued in their wickedness. Noah's life was a beacon of hope in a world that had lost its way, a reminder that even in the midst of corruption, there are those who still seek after God. When the time came and the floodwaters began to rise, Noah and his family entered the ark, along with pairs of every kind of animal. The door was closed, and the rains began to fall. The flood would wipe away the corruption of the world, but through Noah's faithfulness, life would be preserved, and a new beginning would emerge. Chapter 8. The preparation of the ark. The construction of the ark was a monumental task, one that required both faith and perseverance. God had given Noah specific instructions, detailing the size, materials, and structure of the ark. It was to be made of gopher wood, sealed with pitch inside and out, and built to withstand the torrential rains and the rising floodwaters. The ark was not just a boat. It was a lifeline, a vessel of salvation in the midst of impending destruction. Noah, along with his sons, set to work, cutting down trees, shaping the wood, and assembling the massive structure. The sound of hammers and saws echoed across the land as the ark slowly took shape. It was an arduous process, one that took years to complete, but Noah never wavered in his commitment to the task. He knew that this was God's plan, and he trusted that the ark would fulfill its purpose. As the ark grew larger, the people in the surrounding area began to take notice. They would come to watch Noah and his family at work, laughing and mocking them for their efforts. "What are you doing, Noah?" they would sneer. "Building a boat in the middle of dry land? Have you lost your mind?" They couldn't comprehend the idea of a flood, something so far beyond their experience. To them, Noah's actions seemed foolish, a waste of time and resources. But Noah was not deterred. He continued to work, day after day, year after year, even as the mockery grew louder. He knew that the flood was coming, even if the people around him didn't believe it. He preached to them, warning them of the judgment to come, pleading with them to turn from their wicked ways. But they laughed in his face, their hearts hardened by sin. As the years passed, the ark finally neared completion. It stood tall and imposing, a massive structure capable of holding Noah, his family, and pairs of every kind of animal. The animals came to Noah by God's guidance, a procession of life that would survive the coming destruction. Male and female of each species entered the ark, for God had chosen them to repopulate the earth after the floodwaters receded. When the ark was ready and all had entered, God himself closed the door. The time for mercy had passed, and the time for judgment had come. The rains began to fall, slowly at first, but soon they became a torrential downpour. The fountains of the deep burst forth, and the waters rose higher and higher, covering the land and washing away the sin and corruption that had filled the earth. Chapter 9. The Flood, God's Judgment and Mercy. The flood began as a gentle rain, but soon it grew into a deluge, the skies darkening as torrents of water poured down upon the earth. The ground shook as the fountains of the deep burst forth, releasing water from the very heart of the earth. Rivers swelled, lakes overflowed, and the waters rose higher and higher, covering everything in their path. The flood was not just a rainstorm. It was the very fabric of creation unraveling, a cleansing of the earth from the corruption that had consumed it. Inside the ark, Noah and his family huddled together, listening to the roar of the storm outside. The animals, too, were restless, their instincts telling them that something monumental was happening. But amidst the chaos, there was also a sense of peace. Noah knew that they were safe, that God had provided this vessel of salvation to carry them through the storm. He had trusted in God's word, and now, even as the waters rose, his faith was being rewarded. Outside the ark, the world was being swept away. The cities, once filled with life, were now submerged beneath the waves. The people who had mocked Noah, who had laughed at the idea of a flood, were now scrambling to find safety. But it was too late. The door of the ark was closed, and the floodwaters showed no mercy. Every living thing that walked the earth, every creature that had the breath of life, perished in the flood. Yet even in this act of judgment there was mercy. The flood was not an arbitrary punishment. It was a necessary cleansing. The earth had become so filled with violence and corruption that it could no longer sustain life in the way God had intended. The floodwaters washed away the sin and darkness, leaving behind a world that could once again reflect the Creator's glory. For 40 days and 40 nights, the rains continued, and the waters covered even the tallest mountains. The ark floated upon the surface, carrying within it the promise of a new beginning. Inside, Noah and his family waited, their faith in God sustaining them through the long days and nights. They knew that the flood was not the end, but a new beginning, a fresh start for humanity and the earth. When the rains finally stopped and the waters began to recede, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah sent out a dove to see if the land was dry, and when it returned with an olive leaf, he knew that the time of judgment had passed. The flood had done its work, cleansing the earth of its corruption. Now a new chapter in the story of humanity was about to begin. Chapter 10, the Antediluvian world, a place of beauty and darkness. Before the flood, the world was a place of contrasts, a land of breathtaking beauty and overwhelming darkness. The earth itself was abundant, a place where life flourished in ways that are difficult to imagine today. The climate was more temperate, the air fresher, and the land more fertile. Forests stretched for miles. Rivers and lakes sparkled with purity, and the trees grew tall, their branches heavy with fruit. It was a world teeming with life, a place where the potential for greatness seemed limitless. Mankind, too, was different in those days. People lived for centuries, their lifespans far longer than what we know today. With such long lives, they were able to accumulate vast amounts of knowledge and wisdom. They mastered the art of farming, learning to cultivate the earth and bring forth its bounty. They built cities and civilizations, developing skills in architecture, craftsmanship, and trade. The early generations were capable of great accomplishments, for God had blessed them with an understanding of His creation. Yet, alongside this beauty and potential, there was a darkness that crept into the hearts of men. With their long lives came pride and arrogance. They believed that they could rule the earth without God, that they no longer needed the Creator who had given them life. The cities they built became monuments to their own greatness, places where they worshipped the works of their own hands, rather than the God who had made them. Violence spread across the land, fueled by greed, envy, and lust for power. Men took many wives, not out of love, but out of a desire to dominate and control. The strong oppressed the weak, and the principles of justice and mercy were forgotten. Mankind's arrogance grew with each passing generation, and with it, their rebellion against God. They built temples to idols, offered sacrifices to false gods, and engaged in practices that were detestable in the eyes of the Creator. The Antediluvian world, for all its beauty, was a place where mankind had lost its way. The people, once created to walk in communion with God, had chosen to live for themselves. They sought after wealth, power, and pleasure, believing that these things would bring them happiness. But in doing so, they had forsaken the one thing that could truly satisfy their souls, the love and guidance of their Creator. The world before the flood was a tragic reflection of what happens when mankind turns away from God. It was a place where beauty and potential were overshadowed by sin and corruption, where the darkness in the human heart had spread like a plague across the earth. Yet, even in this dark time, there was still hope. For amidst the corruption, there were those who still sought after God, those who would carry the light of His truth forward into the next chapter of human history.